So question 3, why does analogical reasoning break down when trying to bridge the divide between fact and value, or science and religion? The point I was trying to make with the video, I don't know what video you ended up watching, the second one, but science is absolutely fantastic today. But it does scare us because there are some things that science has enabled that's also scary. For example, genetically modified products were being experimented on by food producers. We're eating foods that, strictly speaking, never were food before.
Beans.
High fructose corn sweetener, partially hydrogenated oils, all that kind of thing. And apart from the fact that some people end up putting plastic in food for babies, that's pretty sad. Probably familiar with that? Chinese baby food manufacturer put melamine in baby food, which, by the way, kills children that eat enough of it. That actually happened. That, by the way, they were not just targeting American children, they were feeding that to Chinese children too. You heard about that, yes? So, made the food taste better. Tasted like it had more protein in it, apparently. I had one friend, lifelong friend from college days. She and her husband bought a new house. Shortly after they moved into it, they started getting various kinds of illnesses that they didn't know where they were coming from. It was finally determined that they were getting it because of the plasterboard included toxins in the house. And the only thing they could do was rip all the old plasterboard down, which basically means you're gutting the house and then completely replacing it with new stuff. Well, it turned out that all the plasterboard had been purchased by an American corporation from China. And the American corporation was deemed not guilty for doing it. It was the Chinese corporation that had done it. But the trouble is, international law doesn't give us the means to charge them to pay the difference. So, of course, they ended up having to pay themselves for the damage. The insurance companies wouldn't even cover. The couple had to pay for all the work on the house. There was no insurance to cover it because everyone said it's not our fault, it's not covered under this, it's not, there was no.
Should have burned it down.
Well, it was still worth a lot. The exterior was fine. The wiring, the floors, it's the plasterboard that had to be completely redone. And, there's no. By the way, there's, I think, Stephen Brennan, the justice that retired a while back. Or is he still there? Brian. Court in the world. When you talk about, a lot of people complain about the Supreme Court being activist judges. We don't want activist judges. We just want them to stick to the Constitution and precedent. Well, the trouble is, in a situation like that where we have a contractor in China that's responsible for something that happened to an American, And by the way, of course, it wasn't just that one house. You imagine this was quite an outrageous problem, and it would have bankrupted the Chinese company that did it. But guess what? You feel like they deserve it because of what they did, right? But guess what? The international relationships have no mechanism by which an American court can sue and force a foreign corporation to pay for grievances of that sort. But what he points out is that American laws have to be dealing with modern issues, that never were a problem before. A lot of issues associated with, well, we'll talk about Facebook. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams did not have Facebook.
This is true.
Right? And of course, you remember Abraham Lincoln's famous quote that you can't trust everything you read on the internet. In other words, the Constitution had no idea these kinds of things would develop, and guess what? You need new law to deal with it, and guess what? The Constitution doesn't really give you guidelines for these kinds of things. If you're curious about all that, read Stephen Breyer, Supreme Court Justice, pointing out all of these problems, that they have to basically break new law boundaries. And when, by the way, just throw this in, think of it, all of these laws are analogical arguments. So what you're basically in a situation is saying, in Ferguson, versus so-and-so or whatever, you had this pattern, and here you have this same pattern, so therefore the court should impose the same decision on this. By the way, there's some interesting things about living in Alaska in this regards. In all other states, as I understand it, at least one university has a law library. I'm not sure about Wyoming, but I know at least Alaska does not have a law library. It's associated with the university where there's a law school. One of the reasons why we do not have a law school is because we have to have a law library on campus in its own building. It's a requirement. In order to have a law school, you have to have a law library on campus in its own building. And we don't have the money for that. There's even good argument, and by the way, the argument was made about 20 years ago or so by John Havelock, who was the state attorney general under the Egan administration. So how long ago was that? I don't remember. A while back. And he argued that we didn't need a law school. We weren't ready for it. More recently, however, he now says, now we need a law school. We have enough people here, and the university should have a law school on the UAA campus. And some Bodo used his old argument and said, no, this guy says we shouldn't have one. That's just funny, right? His old argument 20 years ago, no, but things have changed. We now have more people, we have more of a need, etc. Well, one of the reasons the law library is nice to have is because when lawyers go to court, they can call upon the law library, which is usually supported by the law school, the faculty, and others in the law school, in order to tell the lawyers how a certain particular case has been handled in the past by the justices in this state. Well, but we don't have a law library, so we don't have those records, and no one's in charge of keeping them, and as a result, lawyers are always having to make up their own cases with no precedents to back them up. And judges have to make new decisions based on all of those because they don't have all of the precedents sitting there being analyzed by the faculty of the law library of the state. Does that make sense? So basically, our legal costs are much higher because we don't have.
Could we recreate the wheel there?
They're making new law basically in the courtroom all the time because we don't have the support of that. So there's a good argument for why we should have a law school in state. Notice though we have something similar, or similar to the WWAMI program. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. So they've developed a new attachment to a consortium of universities in the same area. So what is it? Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Alaska,
Montana, isn't it?
Montana.
Washington.
Yeah. Forgetting the WWAMI. Is
Washington, Alaska,
Montana.
Idaho.
Yeah. So the same consortium of states now is offering law school. But by the way, we still don't have the library, so we still don't. In fact, the archives that we did have been moved to Washington. So you can't even do research and archival law work in Anchorage anymore. You have to go to you have to go out of state to do it. Is that right? I'm old enough that I'm not remembering everything. Okay, so it was split, I think. Some of it went to Juneau, but I think the most of it went to Seattle. So we don't even have, so if you're going to do research on a lot of that, you have to go out of state to do it. So my lawyer friends all think that's pitiful, but then they would, right? They would be.
I think I do remember this. They used to be on 4th Avenue. There was a building on 4th Avenue that held the archives.
Oh well. So science is great, basically, but it's all inductive reasoning, which means that it's a guess. They're just really, really good guesses. So we should trust them. But they're not going to have the same kind of absolute certitude that you get with mathematics. But then the reason for that is mathematics is a fake system, basically, created without feet in reality that could screw it up, right? You can screw it up. I mean, when you talk about the length of this table, we talk about it in inches, perhaps. We could talk about it in centimeters. Those are, I think you could figure out the equivalent. But guess what? If you really want to measure it accurately with, say, photons or something, it's not actually going to be a consistent measurement. It's going to change depending on the room temperature, and things of that sort. So we can mess up. We can mess with math and get some really weird results, for sure. The problem of the infinite. A lot of these are absolute puzzles that can't be solved. As Tom, by the way, was pointing out, there are 4 basic ancient Greek puzzles that no one can solve, even still today, as far as I know. But now this question, why does analogical reasoning break down when trying to bridge the divide between fact and value? Remember the problem that we talked about when we were talking about language and true statements, that I can say that this is a cup, that's absolutely true. I can say it's a good cup, that's neither true nor false. Although even, I would, let's see, I could say this is a terrible cup. It's still not true or false. It's still a matter of opinion. Other people could still say, oh, it's a good cup, but just don't spill it, right? It's still hot, so that works. The problem here is morality, of course. Some moral statements by our contemporary point of view. And by the way, this is, when I say our, I mean Northern European, roughly since about 1770, that academic point of view is that moral statements are neither true nor false. Obviously, St. Aquinas thought there were true and false moral statements that you could make. Such and such is a sin, such and such is virtuous, etc. Those were clearly true or false in European culture at that time. But roughly around 1770, and the person I'm talking about is David Hume. Notice he died in 1776. Some British people believe that he was the greatest British philosopher. You could argue over that. I mean, that's not a true or false statement, right? Others might argue that Bertrand Russell was the greatest. Others might argue that A.C. Grayling's the greatest. It's an interpretation, right? So you can't prove that. But what David Hume did prove to all those that read him, especially Immanuel Kant, by the way, who read his work and was woken from his dogmatic slumbers. So, if you're anybody familiar with Immanuel Kant, German philosopher?
Peripherally.
Yeah. Well, in any case, even though Kant deals with David Hume's work, he accepts his overall conclusion, and that's basically what I already gave you with the pool table thing. That was actually a David Hume argument, that when you get right down to it, I can't ever know for sure that the cue ball will knock the 8 ball in the pocket based on my memory of previous events. In fact, it gets worse. It gets worse than that. You actually have no real concept of yourself. You've never really experienced yourself as an object for yourself, because you can't see yourself, because you are your own subjective self that's having the experience. I'm messing this up. But basically, even if you see your reflection in the mirror, it's not you that you're seeing, it's your reflection. So you can't actually experience yourself, and the empiricists believed that the only thing you could know for sure is what you were experiencing at the moment. So you're noticing that you have an itchy nose. That's true for you. You know, there's no doubt you have an itchy nose. Could be just your imagination. You could be asleep, dreaming that you have an itchy nose, but that you have an itchy nose is something you know for sure, right? But the trouble is, did I have an itchy nose yesterday? Well, I remember that I had an itchy nose, but guess what? That's not proof that I had an itchy nose yesterday. That might be just an illusion that I'm having about my memory yesterday. You see, it gets worse, you know. And so he applies this to cause and effect. How do we know that there are actual necessary relationships between cause and effect? So I'd say that the cue ball hitting the 8 ball was a necessary cause associated with the effect of the 8 ball going into the pocket. Well, problem is that's still all based on my memory. How do I know? I remember it happening, but that's not logical grounds for it. What would logic be, right? Is it logical necessity? No, because I can imagine something else happening. In fact, I can imagine, here I am, I'm all lined up, I take my shot, and just as the cue ball is about to hit the 8 ball, the 8 ball jumps up in the air and goes, woohoo, you can't get me! And the cue ball goes under it and sinks itself into the cue ball, into the pocket as it goes by the 8 ball, and it says to the 8 ball, hey, you can't do that. Clunk. What happened to me? I like thinking of myself as popping into a tune. Do you remember Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Where you could like leave the real world and then end up in a tune. Remember the cars were all worried about dip and all that. I loved. What was the name of the one character that says it's not. I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way. Jessica Rabbit. Yeah. Well, obviously that doesn't really happen unless you're on drugs. Yeah. Who are you? This is the blue caterpillar, which is a real hint, I suppose. Although I think Severus Snape did a great job as the caterpillar. So, what happened? My imagination was playing games with me, right? That doesn't really happen. But the thing is, since I can imagine something like that, that means that necessity, the logical necessity, I think, associated with cause and effect, isn't logically necessary, because I can imagine something else happening. So it's not logical necessity that causes the necessary connection. So then Hume says, well, what is the necessary, what puts the necessity into this connection? And the answer is, well, it's just always been that way. I remember it being that way. But remember, he's already devastated memory as your support for absolute fact, right? So science is all screwed up ever since. Thank you, David Hume. Now, you might think that that's a bad thing, but actually everyone that writes about this says this is absolutely fantastic because it really opened everybody's mind to recognizing that the traditional interpretation of things should be subject to reevaluation, that we should always look at more opportunities to study what might be causing something. So in a sense that really resulted in a blossoming of science instead of you think that's just going to be depressing, that we can't know stuff, but it actually just blew science, out of the box and let everybody go out and start trying new things. So it was actually a good thing. And notice that it's after that you get the steam engine and you get all the radical developments. And it's just amazing what happens after that. So David Hume was a good thing, but scientists don't talk as if they're proving anything anymore because of the impact he had on their language. So we end up then knowing that science is the way to do things, the way to find out stuff, and yet at the same time what they're finding out is a guess. So that's kind of frustrating. Along comes John Stuart Mill, who gives us new ways of doing inductive reasoning. You ever heard of John Stuart Mill? Very famous, another great British philosopher. He didn't think he was so much of a genius. He just worked really hard. So he knew a lot of people that he thought were geniuses, and he thought of himself as not of that caliber, but he worked really hard. His father taught him, he was homeschooled by his father, who was a utilitarian. Utilitarianism is a philosophy associated with the British. The main principle of utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number. Or, if you're a Harry Potter fan, for the greater good, abbreviated. Any of you are Harry Potter fans done this before? One person or something. Yeah. But, for the greater good is J.K. Rowling's principle that she throws at Voldemort, the bad guy. So if you're familiar with the books, she clearly has it in for utilitarianism. She's not a fan. That's just fun. She's also not a fan of the royalty. Part of the bad side of her books are all of those who are pure blood versus half-bloods and muggle-borns and so on and so forth, right? There's kind of a class warfare among the wizards and the witches in the books. Sorry if you're not into it. Remember though, we just had a Quidditch match on Sunday at the Luzak, so it's in this town. So if you have children, your children will know about these stories. It's not my fault. And I'm not a fan, by the way. I just read the books and read them, watch the movies, and then I read the books about the books. But the reason I do all that is because I'm absolutely amazed that a woman sitting in a cafe with a baby in a stroller can write a book and make billions of dollars. That's impressive. He never made billions of dollars. But
You didn't write Harry Potter.
no, in fact, he wrote no novels at all.
Well,
But he did invent something called liberalism in his book on liberty. He did invent inductive logic in his book, Logic. And we still use what's called Mill's methods today. You might think that's kind of silly, but in his day, and by the way, that's same as Charles Dickens. Familiar with Charles Dickens? Oliver Twist, Christmas Carol. Basically invented the novel, as far as I know, Charles Dickens. Started out as a serial in a newspaper that came out each week, something like that. New chapter each week. But he wrote tons of books, most of which nobody reads because they're horrible. but some of them are absolutely fantastic, like Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist, Great Expectations. Gosh, well, that's Charles Dickens, not John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill's books include A System of Logic. His book on liberty invents what we would think. By the way, this is the conservative liberal point of view. So today in our parlance, we might call it the libertarian point of view, more than the liberal point of view. And the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number was based on happiness. So if you think of it this way, Mill and his contemporaries in England and Auguste Comte in France, both groups were reaching the point of view that traditional religion was bad and caused things like wars and corruption and all sorts of things. And so we ought to do away with traditional religion, but morality was absolutely necessary. And if traditional morality was based in traditional religion, then what you would need if you were getting rid of traditional religion was some new kind of moral authority. And what would that be? Well, they both thought that the state was the new moral authority. And so they argued that there ought to be new bases for morality and loyalty to the state. And so rituals had to be created that would enable everyone to feel the same kind of spiritual attachment to the state that you used to have to the religion. So we would have holidays, which, instead of, obviously those are holy days, but instead the point is to celebrate the state. So you have military parades, you have military statues, you have heroes, praised for the things they did for the state and so on. There was a difference between the French view. Auguste Comte believed that attendance at such state functions ought to be mandatory. John Stuart Mill thought that they should be voluntary. And we followed John Stuart Mill, so when we have our 4th of July parade, your boss doesn't give you the day off, but then make sure that you show up at the parade or at the table where you help give out candy to the kids, or and take names, and anybody that doesn't show up gets docked pay or something. We don't have something like that. The communists did, by the way. Karl Marx came in really following Auguste Comte more on that than John Stuart Mill, even though most of Marx's writing, his later writing, was in England. They kicked him out of Germany, then they kicked him out of France, and so he ended up writing a lot of his works in the, I forget the name of the library, which library was it? One of the libraries in London. And up until just a few years ago, by the way, you could still see the desk where he wrote some of his works, Das Kapital, for example. But they decided to remodel the library and it's gone. I don't know what they did with it. It's kind of interesting. British are pretty weird that way. There's one of John Stuart Mill's teachers was Jeremy Bentham, can see, Jeremy Bentham is still there. That's actually his body, but this is a waxed version of his face. But if you could see the floor of the picture, it shows that the actual head.
Oh, his head is down there.
Yeah, his head is actually still there.
Oh, my stars.
And from what I understand, his will required that he attend all the meetings of the Royal Society or something. So every time they have a monthly meeting or whatever, they wheel that little booth into the meeting and sign him in as attending.
Wow.
That's just funny, I think. By the way, I've had students go to London and post pictures of themselves, selfies with that. That's cool when you get that. They've actually posted them on Facebook so that I get to see them with Jeremy Bentham. It's just like in the hallway. The only thing near it is like a snack bar. So it's not really very, it's very British, I suppose, I have to say. I don't know. Another interesting thing, I guess I find it interesting, is this is in Edinburgh in Scotland. David Hume was Scottish, sorry, and so he's buried in Scotland. So that's Hume's tomb. By the way, there's a statue of Lincoln right here. I don't know if you can see it in any of the other pictures. And you wonder what the heck is a picture of Lincoln doing? Here it is. See, there's Lincoln. That's a war memorial to the Scottish dead who died in the Civil War in the United States. That's just interesting too. So, other famous books that John Stuart Mill wrote on liberty. I guess those are the two most significant. Oh, he, by the way, worked for the British East India Company, as you can see, for quite a long time. His father did too. He didn't work in India. He worked in the office in London, on like the 3rd floor, to show where his office was, etc. He was against, not against, I guess, for women's liberation. And his wife, Harriet Taylor, co-authored the book on, what was it, women's suffrage, women's rights, the subjection of women. He was also in the Parliament. So pretty interesting guy. But let me show you Mill's method.